ChristianGeekCentral.com.
Hey everybody, this is Offscreen Kim here to bring you another book review from the Crossover Alliance. This time it's David N. Alderman's Black Earth, End of the Innocence, which is the first book in his Black Earth series and the first novel out of the gates for the CA. The premise for this book is as follows. On the night of his high school graduation, Nathan Pierce collapses on stage from a strange vision and learns that he has been chosen for some great and daunting destiny. Meanwhile, two of his other classmates decide to ditch the ceremony, one seeking solace from her guilt and answers about her own mysterious abilities, another wanting to live it up, party hard, and enjoy her adult freedoms to the fullest. But that same night, dozens of meteors begin falling to Earth, diverting all our characters' lives, wrecking cities, creating political chaos, and perhaps bringing something even darker along with them. Now, this is definitely a Christian apocalypse tale, but it's also got a lot of sci-fi in it, too. Other than Pater's Spirit Blade and the C.S. Lewis Space Trilogy, sci-fi and Christianity generally don't get paired up, and it's nice to see them working in tandem here for a change. This blending of genres and concepts that don't normally go together is something that Alderman seems to really excel at. The best way I can describe this book is that it's kind of like putting Left Behind and Independence Day in a blender, then sprinkling on some time travel and superhero elements. It's a very odd and interesting mix. So, does that mean I liked it? Unfortunately, no. This was just not the book for me, and I'm not going to hold that general opinion hostage in an attempt to keep you listening for what's going to be a long talk. But I do want to go into precisely why I felt that way, and what aspects of the book I liked and disliked, because you might feel very differently about those same things. I know I've got some weird tastes and opinions, and I'm not just here to deliver my decrees of what is good and what is bad. I want to help you decide whether you might enjoy this book, even if I didn't. So I'm going to talk you through my thoughts on End of the Innocence, and even if you disagree with my conclusions, hopefully I can still give you some useful information to form your own. One of the first things you need to know about End of the Innocence is that this is definitely not your grandma's Lifeway novel. There is some seriously hardcore content involved here. This is what the Crossover Alliance calls a white label book. What that means is that it's the hardest of their hard content, and they do not recommend it for readers under 18. There's very little rough language in End of the Innocence, but in every other aspect, this book would definitely be rated R. You're going to get violence here, up to and including the killing of children. You're going to get some sexual content, including situations that happen on screen. And I feel compelled to add an additional trigger warning. If you will be personally and deeply disturbed by a very frank depiction of a rape, please do not read this book. Your mental and emotional health is more important than any work of fiction. The other big thing you need to know about End of the Innocence is that this is book 1 of 4 in the Black Earth series. David N. Alderman, the author, had previously published this entire Black Earth series independently, but now that he's with the Crossover Alliance, my understanding is that he has taken the old versions out of print and is now reissuing them at one-year intervals under the Crossover Alliance label. That makes this book a bit hard for me to judge, because this is one of those series where book 1 is only 1/4 of a big story, as opposed to one of 4 successive stories. It's a lot more like just reading Fellowship of the Ring, as opposed to just reading The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's far less self-encapsulated. That means it's hard to make judgments on the book because so many plot lines are left unfinished and I don't know where they're going to go. Since the resolution can really make or break a plot arc, it's difficult to make a call without one, but I'm going to try my best. Now, this quarter of a story per book deal may be bad news for you if you're one of those people who likes to read a story all at once. In that case, you might want to put Black Earth on the back burner for now and come back to it in a few years when you can read the whole story at one go. The good news for you, though, is that because Alderman has already finished all the manuscripts, he's not going to be pulling a Robert Jordan on you and leaving you hanging for 20 years. So at least you don't have to be afraid of that. Now let's get into the dirt of the book. First, let's talk about what Alderman does really well, and that's spectacle. When the meteors are slamming to Earth, when the bullets and punches are flying, when the flashy alien superpowers are unleashed, this author has my complete and giddy attention. He knows how to make things exciting, he knows how to make things weird and cool and unique. But it's not just action that I'd put in the spectacle category. Alderman's also got a lot of interesting concepts going on here. There's the whole genre mashup idea that forms the foundation of the book. There are strange alien races and backstories. And there's some clever and creepy weird science concepts. It's a great batch of ideas. He's clearly a big idea man. Another strong point is that Alderman gives his settings plenty of love, both the bizarre and the mundane ones. It's easy to picture yourself in the places he describes, and he doesn't limit himself to visual detail like I've caught a lot of other authors doing, so good on him. I also give him props for carefully aligning his setting details to reality, to the point that I'm able to follow his characters around the Phoenix area on Google Earth. That's amazing. I always appreciate that sort of local attention in a book set on contemporary Earth. I love being able to recognize places that I've seen before and find ones that I haven't if I surf around the internet. The only problems that I have with the setting are temporal ones. This is supposed to be set in 2008. Now think for a moment. When was the last time you saw anyone under the age of 25 wearing a watch or reading a print magazine? Yeah, I thought so. Those are fairly minor things, though. The main thing that strikes me as out of sync with the time is how numb to tyranny most of the American public seems to be in this book. People generally take years to start seeing new government intrusions as normal and acceptable, which is why dystopian tales tend to be set at least a generation into the future, to allow time for that priming of society, to allow the world to change enough that everyone sees what we consider horrible as the new norm. Now, I can totally believe that in 2008, the government might decide to take the under God part out of the Pledge of Allegiance. What I can't believe is that they decide to try to wipe every record of the previous version out of print and make it as if it had never been. We live in a society that regards freedom of information as a thing of great importance, and there are plenty of people who don't give a fig about religion or patriotism who would still get very upset by that sort of revisionism. You cannot tell me there would not be internet activists jumping onto this issue. The government can't keep the latest episode of Game of Thrones off the internet. There's no way they could keep people from passing around a paragraph of text. Let's talk about how this book is structured. Alderman is clearly aiming for an epic scope and feel here. Like many writers of large-scale fantasy, he employs a rotating third-person limited perspective, where he switches from character to character to character as he shows us different aspects of the world. Now, sometimes these multiple perspectives are used really well. In one instance, we see a meteor fall past one character's helicopter, and then, after the perspective switch, we realize how very close that character was to someone else when we see another character recovering from the impact of that same meteor. Or sometimes Alderman will give us several characters who each have one small piece of a puzzle, enabling the sharp-eyed reader to put them together and find the solution before the characters can. Other times, though, the multiple perspective style results in repetition and overexposure. For example, we get to witness the exact same text conversation we read before, only from the other end. And we have what could have been a shocking betrayal spoiled by being in a position to hear the betrayer plotting earlier. Also, sometimes the author just seems to struggle with the limitation of staying within one character's mind at a time. Every once in a while, the narration will discuss things that the current viewpoint character has no possible way of knowing. And I remember one instance in which the viewpoint character actually dies, but the chapter just keeps going, leaving me wondering whose eyes I was supposed to be seeing out of for the last page or so. Now, this book has 17 viewpoint characters, so there are a lot of subplots going on here. That's standard for this multi-book style of storytelling. And since this is essentially a disaster movie in book form, the primary conflict is that terror is falling from heaven, and the main goal of most of our protagonists is trying not to die. Now, there's no way that big conflict is going to be resolved in book 1 of 4, so that's why we have these other little subplots to give the story some waypoints and a sense of progress while the author keeps the big conflict looming. So let's count up the subplots here, shall we? We've got what's going on with my superpowers. We've got several characters that have family issues. We got a kind of sort of romance that's kind of sort of starting to bloom between two characters. We've got two characters recovering from major personal trauma. We've got an immortal seeking death. We've got two kids seeking their parents in this horrible ruined world. We've got two alien refugees that are trying to find each other. We've got a murder mystery. We've got a space colonization attempt. We've got time travel. We've got an oppressive political regime. We've got journalistic intrigues against it. We've got hackers trying to overthrow it. And whoa! We got a lot of stuff going on here. Now, guess how many of these issues get resolved in this book? 2. Everything else just sort of circles the block a few times without making any noticeable progress. So you got to take all those other plot points, load them on a cart, store them in your memory vault for a year, and then haul them back out over to book 2 when book 2 becomes available. I think that's a lot to ask of readers. I'm not saying that Alderman should give us less plot, but maybe he could have deferred introducing some of these characters and plots until book 2 or even 3. That way there could have been more closure here in book 1. As it is, book 1 feels like a whole lot of build-up and very little payoff. The trade-off for the massive multiplayer scope of Black Earth is a limit to the time spent with each individual character. And that does make effective resolutions within the time frame of one book difficult to pull off. This is even more difficult in End of the Innocence, since a close reading of this book will reveal that it only covers a 24-hour span of time. This short time frame not only makes it almost impossible to resolve some subplots, it also creates some logistical problems. For example, we meet a character in Mesa, Arizona sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. Then the next time we see him, he's in Hume, California in the middle of the night, and then he doubles back and pops up somewhere in New Mexico before the sun rises. Now, barring some sort of teleportation or super speed, which we're given no indication of, that's just not possible. Also, apparently somewhere in DC there is a salon that's open in the middle of the night. If such things are true, I want one here in Louisville. I would love to be able to close up the library at night and then go relax with a pedicure. That would be awesome. Yes, I know, I occasionally actually am a girl. Moving on. The dialogue in this book is a mixed bag. Often it sounds perfectly natural, but it turns awkward often enough to comment on. Apparently, no one in the Pierce family ever calls each other by their actual names, only their relationships. Daisy always calls Nathan brother, he always calls her sis, the dad calls Nathan son, and I guess it's a good thing the Pierces only have one child of each gender, or things could get very confusing. Another example. If I'm going to complain about the president, I'm not going to say, that President Barack Obama has gone too far this time. No, I'm just going to call him the president, or Obama. If the aliens or the immortals were the ones saying things in these overly formal and stilted ways, that would make perfect sense. But when the speaker is supposed to be an ordinary person, it doesn't work so well. Several characters in this book seem to share the same vocabulary, even when they ought to have different ones. For example, two characters in two different places both describe a smell, a very subjective sensation, in exactly the same words. The biggest example of this issue, though, concerns the meteors falling to Earth. Everyone in End of the Innocence continues to refer to these meteors as stars, even though they are clearly not. If an actual star collides with this planet, it would be game over for everyone here, bam, like that. These are meteors. They are moderate-sized chunks of rock and not giant flaming balls of gas. I could understand some characters, especially the younger or the less educated ones, referring to them as stars, but not others. The president, whose speechwriters should know better even if she doesn't, still calls them stars. Nathan, whose hobby is astronomy, still calls them stars. One guy at NASA corrects someone who refers to the falling objects as stars, and everyone around him acts like he's being a pedantic tool. Personally, I see him as the smartest man in the room. I know Alderman is riffing on the imagery of Revelation here, but I feel like enforcing this terminology on all the characters hurts the natural flow of dialogue and potentially damages the reader's suspension of disbelief. The editing issues in this book are definitely fewer than those I noticed in the Crossover Alliance anthology, but they're still present. Most of the mistakes I noticed were actually the same mistakes repeated again and again, which to me indicates not so much a lack of care as a lack of expertise. It seems like someone certainly did proofread this manuscript, but chose to let certain turns of phrase stand because he didn't see them as mistakes. For example, almost every time in this book when Alderman says may, the word he really wants is might. Little things like that crop up every now and then, but at least there appears to have been consistent effort applied in the editing department, which is a step forward. I will take that and gladly. I'm not going to hold any of my editing complaints against the book's final score, but I am going to make a quick public service announcement about one particular grammatical issue that runs rampant across End of the Innocence. All right. It's two words. That's A-L-L space R-I-G-H-T, two words. There is no such word as A-L-R-I-G-H-T. It is a pernicious rot in the language. I know it's slowly gaining acceptance thanks to the internet. I know I'm losing this battle, but I do not care. I'm a cranky old Luddite librarian, and I'm going to fight the long defeat on this one. Please, authors, please don't let A-L-R-I-G-H-T win. I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Let's talk about the characters in End of the Innocence. While there are some that I genuinely like and find interesting, like Daisy, Erica, Jasper, and Griffin, I'm disappointed by the lack of surprises in the characterization. In the Black Earth universe, everyone apparently is exactly who they initially seem to be. Not once in this story did I encounter a character who at first seemed selfish and unpleasant, but later proved to be a loyal ally. Nor one who seemed friendly and supportive at first, but then revealed a sinister side. Anyone who gets on our hero's bad sides turns out to be a genuinely bad person, and not just part of a personality conflict. Anyone given an unflattering first impression will be shown to be useless and contemptible at best, and outright villainous at worst. One character in particular seemed to be the poster girl for this problem. When she's first introduced, Alderman mentions her physical and attractiveness several times in one scene, which struck me as odd and kind of mean, especially since we get so little physical description of other, more central characters. I can't tell you one thing about hero Nathan Pierce's looks, for example. But then, after that literally ugly first impression, she keeps getting loaded with more and more unpleasant traits. She's fat, she's bossy, she's foolish, she's shown to be less capable than a child in a crisis, she's cowardly, she's adulterous, and at some point in all this it just becomes ridiculous that all these failings have been crammed into one person. Clearly I was supposed to dislike her, but instead I started feeling a sort of perverse sympathy for her, as if the author was holding her down and refusing to let her have even one redeeming quality. To paraphrase Guardians of the Galaxy, I don't think anybody's 100% a tool. That's just not human. I'm okay with demons being portrayed as totally corrupt, but not people. People generally have at least a few little tiny virtues tucked away somewhere deep in them if you go digging for them. I understand Alderman wanting to show clear right and wrong, heroes and villains, but I don't think that requires such sharp edges between black and white. I would have preferred a deeper, more rounded take on characterization. My favorite character in End of the Innocence, hands down, is Daisy Pierce. She's tough, she's determined, but she's not too hard and remote to be likable. She's an untrained normal person in a world full of military specialists and alien superheroes, but I would not want to stand between her and someone she cares about. You mess with her loved ones and she'll give you a fire extinguisher upside the head. She is badass and that is awesome. More of her, please. My least favorite character? Howard Gray. I just found him tedious. I never quite understood what was going on with his backstory or why he made certain decisions, and I felt like his whole subplot was more of a plot tumor growing out of the more interesting story. I'm guessing from the parts I did understand that he's a crossover from the Expired Reality series, and I get wanting to showcase that connection and provide a bit of fan service for readers of that series. But I think Howard Gray would have worked better as a brief cameo than a viewpoint character. As it is, I feel like he's dragging down on this story, and especially on two other characters whose storyline intersects with his. Their goals could have been achieved much sooner if they weren't constantly doubling back to help Howard Gray with his problems, which makes him feel more like a nuisance than a hero. Fortunately, there are plenty of other characters in this book, so let's talk about a few others. If you look at the description of this book on the back cover or on Amazon, it seems like there are three intended primary characters: Nathan, Heather, and Cynthia, aka Sin. All three of these characters are teenagers, and so are a lot of their companions, which means that poor decision making, pettiness, and melodrama are the order of the day. On the one hand, that's a teenager, true to life, and I don't feel like I should dock Alderman for realism. On the other hand, I left high school 16 years ago and you could not possibly pay me enough to go back. Normally, teen heroes would mean that teen readers are the intended audience, but the rating on this book tells me that can't be the case here. The Crossover Alliance intends this to be for adult readers, but I'm afraid they may not have much patience for adolescent foolishness. It's definitely to Alderman's credit that he writes teens like teens and not somehow wiser and more mature than their parents, but I'm not sure why the protagonists needed to be so young in the first place. Maybe that becomes important as the story continues, but if not, I think aging the characters up to their early 20s might have been a better idea. Back to those top three characters I mentioned, Nathan, Heather, and Sin. I'm not sure how I feel about Sin getting that sort of top billing, because she doesn't really do much in this story. It certainly seems like Alderman's setting her up to be more important later, but in End of the Innocence she mainly serves as a witness to more interesting events, rather than a participant in them. She does exactly one thing that affects the main plot, and that's in the last 5 pages of the book. She's kind of like Merry or Pippin in Lord of the Rings. Yeah, they're important characters, but they don't belong front and center on the poster for Fellowship. Sin certainly deserves to be in this book, and she'll probably move into a more heroic role later on, but right now she's just one more along for the ride, and it seems weird to put her up top with Heather and Nathan. Speaking of Sin, let's talk about the names in this book. Some of the naming conventions here make it hard for me to take certain characters seriously. Sin's actual full name is Cynthia Scarlet Ruin. I'm sorry, but if you name your daughter that, you should not be surprised if she grows up to become a porn star. That's not a name for a normal person, that's a stage name for a stripper. And to make it worse, everybody calls her by her nickname, Sin. Everybody except her mother. And yes, that's S-I-N, not C-Y-N. It's universally spelled like the theological concept and not the shortening of Cynthia. Even kindly Christian hero Nathan calls her Sin, which seems rather unkind of him. You've got some villains in here with odd little names like Strange Ways Silver. Okay. Or there's my personal favorite, the Great Witch of Innocence. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I tried to take her seriously, but every time I read that name, I hear Amy Lee singing in my head, and I cannot believe that I'm the only one. I bet you most readers between the ages of about 25 and 40 have the same reaction to that name. The first thing they think of is the band. So unless that's an association that Alderman actually wants the reader to make, and I'm not sure why he would, I'm not sure that name was the best choice. Speaking of villains, along with Mr. Strangeways Silver, cutthroat head of the modestly named Silver Tech, and the Great Witch Emo Band, we've also got the dictatorial President Amanda Stone, a group of unscrupulous mercenaries I like to call SEAL Team Secret 6, and some other more minor baddies. Many of these characters are afflicted with something I call evilitis. Let me explain. Evilitis is a malady that causes characters to compulsively engage in unnecessarily wicked acts, even to the point of hurting their own goals. This includes things like tormenting or even killing their employees for minor infractions, or acting oppressively in ways that would be more likely to foment rebellion than to quash it. For example, there's a reporter who's got incriminating evidence on the president. So the president sends her goons out to steal the evidence. Okay, that makes sense. And then kill the reporter. Wait, what? No. You don't kill the reporter. Just take her tape, leave her with no proof, and then no one will listen to her. If you kill her, then people will wonder what happened to her, which will draw attention to what she was investigating when she died. This course of action creates more suspicion instead of less. Or you've got a villain who gives one of his underlings an alien sex slave as a gift, and he demands that this guy use the alien sexually. He'll be checking later to make sure that the underling actually had sex with the alien. Well, first of all, I'm thinking, what do you care? This isn't a breeding program or anything. It's just a test to see if the underling is sufficiently loyal, which I guess means sufficiently pointlessly evil. Also, depending on precisely what this guy does with the alien chick, your test might not register that. I'm not trying to be gross here, but these are supposedly very corrupt people who live in the internet age. They should be aware of things. Moving on. This sort of hyper-villainous behavior is especially egregious, I think, in Silver and Stone. I find myself asking how on earth these two were able to rise to positions of so much power and authority when they have such poor impulse control. Some of the crazy decisions they make should result in either mass resignations from Silver Tech or Stone being shut down by her own political party. I cannot understand why people tolerate their clearly unhinged behavior when they ought to be able to either walk out or push back. I'm not sure if my complaints about the villains are a cause or a symptom of this next topic I want to talk about, but I'm pretty sure it's related somehow. I know Alderman is trying to do a different take on a Christian novel here. I know he's intentionally aiming for something darker, grittier, and more intense than the usual, and that's a completely valid artistic choice. However, Some of the harsher parts of End of the Innocence strike me as dark simply for darkness' sake. Now, I can't read the author's mind, and I don't know why he chose to include certain gritty elements, but I think that the reason why I feel this way about them is because Alderman doesn't seem to want to explore them very deeply. For example, I mentioned earlier that there is a rape in this book. It happens at the beginning of the book, but very little seems to result from it. The victim worries that she may be pregnant, and she begins to regret some of her other past sexual encounters. Well, those things could just as easily have been the result of consensual sex that the character later regretted. Nothing there really requires a rape. The character doesn't start having trust issues, or being paranoid about her safety, or acting twitchy around men, or trying to take back control of her life. There's no exploration of those sorts of issues and traumas that you'd expect to follow a sexual assault. In fact, the character has a painful and appearance-altering procedure done to her the day after the rape, with apparently no difficulty or ill effects. Now, I understand that part of the reason this event happens right at the beginning of the book is to serve as a big warning flag for the reader that there will be seriously dark things ahead, as an early indicator of just what Black Earth has in store for them content-wise, but I'm very uncomfortable with the way this story raises this trauma and then swiftly brushes it aside to clear the path for the primary plot. It's possible that Alderman is planning to do something more with this later, but so far, I just don't think it was controversy well spent. This sort of hit-and-run darkness is also an aspect of the tonal whiplash I experienced in part of Ends of the Innocence. Sometimes, as I was reading this book, I'd find myself arguing back against my own criticisms, thinking, now come on, Kim, just sit back and enjoy the ride. It's a disaster movie in book form. Just soak up the spectacle, get into the over-the-top atmosphere, and stop nitpicking the logistics. But the more I thought about it, the more I decided that this was being even less fair to the author. I really do not believe that Alderman intended readers to regard this as a turn-your-brain-off popcorn story. If he did, why would he have filled it with serious adult issues like suicide and rape and atonement for your dark deeds? I can't believe that Alderman would have loaded all this weight and trauma onto something that's just supposed to be an ephemeral adventure ride. But then, if I am supposed to be treating End of the Innocence with genuine thought and seriousness, why does it contain things like demonic comic relief? There's a scene in this book where demons are swarming outside a building some of the main characters have fortified. And as the characters are preparing their weapons and readying themselves for the assault, an injured person that they've got with them begins raving. She's in pain. She thinks she's dying. She's confessing every sin she's ever committed because she's terrified that the demons outside are going to drag her bodily off to hell. Then, 2 pages later, the attacking demons are doing pratfalls and minion stunts. Now, am I supposed to be seriously afraid here? Or am I supposed to laugh? The demons bumbling about certainly seems intended to be funny, but I feel bad laughing at it because of all the blood and horror around it. Alderman gives us these little spots of humor here and there, but I feel like he usually positions them too close to something dark to let the comedy actually be relieving. Instead, we get emotional motion sickness. In summary, I think that Alderman is a really good artist, but I think he needs to be partnered with a good technician. Whether that other person functions as co-writer, editor, or even just beta reader, I think someone needs to look at his grand ideas, appreciate them, and recognize what's best in them, but then do the necessary nitpicking to point out when things don't quite line up and figure out how that can be fixed. Not so much someone to tell him no, but someone to ask how and why. Because right now, those questions are going unanswered, and the story suffers from that. I think if Alderman gets that partner, his work could be amazing. As it is, it's not horrible, but I think it's still well short of great. I give Black Earth End of the Innocence a quality score of 7 out of 10 and a relevance score of 9 out of 10. There are a lot of potential discussion points in this book, from theories about the end times to questions about hope and purpose, to the relationship of religion and politics, to issues of internal church conflict. But none of them are explored in much depth. This is clearly a book by a Christian for Christians, and I'd say even beyond that, it's geared to a very specific sort of Christian. The author drops certain issues into this story, like the use of under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, or the semantics debate over the difference between faith and religion, without any explanation of what they entail or why they matter. Apparently, he assumes that the reader already knows and agrees with the character's viewpoints, so he just sort of name-checks the issue and keeps moving. But the problem with that is that if you didn't grow up evangelical and you're not politically conservative, you may find yourself either disagreeing or just sitting there wondering, do people really care that much about this? Because of these audience assumptions, I don't think this would be the best book to share with your unbelieving friends in an attempt to spark discussion. Even if they really enjoy the story, they may find the cursory treatment of some of these ideas gratuitous, confusing, or even alienating. So, do I recommend you read this book? That depends. Anyone who is going to be disturbed by the content should definitely stay away. If you're a very detail-oriented person like me, the sort of person who can't help but pick at inconsistencies, then you'll probably also want to sit this one out. And if you're looking for deep, well-rounded characters, I don't think this is going to be the book for you either. As for who might enjoy this book, if you like both Frank Peretti and George R.R. Martin and want to see what would happen if they were merged in a transporter accident, try this book. If you like Christian apocalypse tales but want a slightly more geeky and offbeat one, try this book. If you felt like Spirit Blade Dark Ritual wasn't just quite dark enough, maybe try this book. If you're the sort of person who likes your villains over-the-top theatrical and full-on crazy evil, then this could be the book for you. And I know the rating on this book recommends adults only, but I think that given the characters' ages, teenagers who are mature enough to handle the content might find this book right up their alley. You can learn more about End of the Innocence, the author David N. Alderman, and the Crossover Alliance at www.thecrossoveralliance.com, and you can purchase the book on Amazon or through the link below in the notes. The book is $16 in paperback or $4 in ebook format. And again, like I said, this might not have been the book for me, but here's hoping it might be right for some of you. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you back next month for another novel review from the Crossover Alliance, Mark Carver and Michael Inatra's Beast.
ChristianGeekCentral.com